In the year 1095, a momentous and unexpected movement began, one that would ripple across continents and reshape the course of history. Thousands of ordinary men and women from all walks of life, farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and children, abandoned their homes, their families, and everything they had ever known. They left behind the safety of their villages and the rhythms of daily life to march toward a distant and unfamiliar land, a place most had only heard about in sermons or legends. They weren't trained soldiers. Many had no weapons, no money, and no idea how to survive the long and perilous journey ahead. And yet, they went, driven by a promise, by fear, by hope, by faith. What could possibly compel entire communities to walk thousands of miles through harsh terrain, across foreign lands, into the heart of danger and war? What belief was so powerful that people were willing to risk and ultimately give their lives for it? Today, we begin to follow their story, a story filled with devotion, violence, courage, and contradiction. A story that began with a single call to arms from a distant pope and grew into one of the most powerful, bloody, and transformative movements in all of human history, the First Crusade. At the end of the 11th century, the Mediterranean was not a calm sea of unified kingdoms, but rather a patchwork of states and empires that competed as much as they traded. Three civilizations dominated the region, each shaped by centuries of development and now standing at a crossroads. Byzantium, heir to the old Roman world, stretched across the Balkans and remnants of Asia Minor. The Islamic world covered immense territory from Spain to Central Asia. And in the Latin Christian West, a restless society once locked in local feuds began to look outward with new ambition. These three centers were not isolated. Pilgrims, merchants, and envoys constantly crossed borders, carrying with them stories, goods, and grievances, creating a climate where cooperation and hostility existed side by side. The Byzantine Empire provided one of the most remarkable cases of endurance in history. By the middle of the 11th century, it remained culturally Greek and firmly rooted in the Orthodox faith. Yet its political situation had grown precarious. One event above all revealed its fragility: the defeat of Manzikert in 1071. There, the Seljuk Turks shattered Byzantine defenses and overran much of Anatolia, which had long supplied the empire with taxes and soldiers. Even the emperor, Romanos IV, was captured on the field. In a gesture almost forgotten today, he was released unharmed and even treated with honor by his captors. That brief courtesy stood in sharp contrast to the cruelty that would define later encounters when war assumed the character of holy conflict. Still, the loss left Byzantium shaken and desperate for allies, a vulnerability that would soon influence its appeals to the West. Looking south and east, the Islamic world of this period did not present the unified front it once had under the great caliphates. The Abbasids in Baghdad still carried symbolic weight, but real authority slipped into the hands of regional dynasties. In Egypt, the Fatimids held power with their Shia identity, while farther to the east, the Seljuks, originally Turkic nomads who embraced Islam, rose to prominence. Their military strength not only humbled Byzantium, but also reshaped the balance of the Near East. Yet, even as they expanded, rivalry between these powers meant the Islamic world was divided both politically and religiously. Strikingly, when Crusaders first marched, Jerusalem did not lie in Seljuk hands, but under the Fatimids. Ironically, their campaign would be aimed against rulers who had restored control of the city rather than those who had lost it. Meanwhile, in the Latin West, a very different transformation was unfolding. After centuries often described as dark, Western Europe saw population growth, new agricultural output, and a fervent religiosity that infused daily life. Lords raised armed followings through the bonds of feudal service, creating a society defined by militarism. Yet alongside this stood an intense devotional culture. Pilgrimage had become one of the most visible expressions of piety, attracting all classes on treks to shrines as distant as Jerusalem. Italian merchant cities like Genoa and Venice thrived in this atmosphere, turning commerce into a tool of war. With armed knights eager for glory, merchants seeking trade, and believers hoping for salvation, the ingredients for a new age of conflict were firmly in place by the eve of the Crusade. By the mid-11th century, pilgrimage was one of the most recognizable features of Christian life in Western Europe. People from all walks of life took up the long journey to sacred sites, often walking hundreds or even thousands of miles. The holy city of Jerusalem ranked as the most revered destination, but Rome and Santiago de Compostela drew countless travelers as well. For many pilgrims, the act promised divine forgiveness, and its physical hardship was itself considered a form of devotion. Families sometimes mortgaged land or sold possessions to gather the resources needed for the trip, a sacrifice that reflects how deeply the practice was woven into religious culture. The pilgrimage was rarely safe or easy. Bandits along roads, outbreaks of disease, and the shifting politics of the regions traversed all pose constant threats. Yet the intensity of faith fueled determination, and streams of pilgrims continued, even with the risk of never returning home. When they did reach Jerusalem, they often found the city accessible, since Muslim rulers generally tolerated the presence of Christian travelers. They typically did so for practical reasons, as pilgrim traffic brought money and bolstered diplomatic connections, but this access began to look uncertain once the Seljuk Turks pushed into the Near East. Their conflicts with other Muslim dynasties created instability, and Christian travelers reported harassment as the security of routes became less predictable. Stories of denied entry or mistreatment circulated in Europe, fueling calls for action. Alongside these traditions of pilgrimage, a new cultural framework developed around the role of knights. The idea of milites Christi, or soldiers of Christ, represented an attempt to merge warrior values with the expectations of the Church. Christianity had long carried ambivalence toward violence, but the feudal world depended on armed men trained for combat. To reconcile this, religious thinkers emphasized that the same martial skills used for private wars could be turned toward the defense of the faith. In this formulation, the sword was no longer merely a tool of personal vengeance or ambition. It could serve as an instrument of piety. This thinking drew on earlier Christian philosophy, especially Augustine's theory of just war. He argued that violence might be acceptable under legitimate authority for moral reasons. During the 11th century, reformers in the Church applied that reasoning to the defense of Christendom itself. From there grew the notion of penitential warfare, in which participating in a church-sanctioned struggle could bring forgiveness of sins similar to completing a pilgrimage. War was now framed not as a contamination of the soul, but as a path toward salvation, provided it was fought under clerical guidance and for the supposed protection of the faith. These concepts profoundly shifted how Christian Europe understood violence. Preachers began urging knights to fight in the name of God, not merely in service of their lords. Some warriors even adopted unusual practices, such as using blunt maces instead of swords to avoid the spilling of blood, though the result remained equally deadly. Pilgrims often carried symbolic items like a satchel, staff, or scallop shell, emblems so recognizable that even impostors sometimes wore them to gain food or sympathy. Together, these cultural habits laid the foundation for the extraordinary call to arms that was about to ignite. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II stood before the gathered clergy and nobles at the Council of Clermont in southern France. The setting may have seemed like one more in a long series of ecclesiastical meetings, but what unfolded changed the course of medieval history. Urban delivered a sermon that did more than address a political alliance or a single military campaign. His words lit a fire that swept through Christian Europe, reshaping how faith and violence were understood together. At the heart of this appeal lay a request from the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos. Pressed on all sides by Seljuk advances in Anatolia, Alexios needed Western soldiers to assist in reclaiming lost territory. Urban used this plea as a springboard to promote a broader vision of Christian unity. He presented the prospect of aid not as mere political cooperation, but as a chance for Western knights to direct their military skills toward a sacred goal. By doing so, he also advanced his own effort to elevate papal authority, hoping to bind a fragmented Christendom more tightly under Rome's leadership. Building on the well-established tradition of pilgrimage, Urban redefined the journey east as an armed act of penance. He encouraged his audience to, quote, take the cross, a phrase that fused the pilgrimage ritual with a military mission. This marked a turning point in medieval religious thought, where fighting, under church blessing, was no longer viewed as a sin, but as salvation. To stir emotions further, Urban described alleged outrages committed against Christians in holy places in Jerusalem. Reports of desecrated churches, massacres, and humiliations were recited, though many accounts were exaggerated or wholly embellished. The purpose was not accuracy, but persuasion. The audience reacted with fervor, and later chroniclers preserved different versions of the speech, each adjusting emphasis, some highlighting piety, and others the vivid horror stories. The impact was immediate. News of this proclamation raced across Europe. Nobles envisioned land and status, peasants heard the promise of redemption, and even individuals on society's margins saw escape in marching east. Historians today argue that Urban himself may have only envisioned aid for the Byzantines, not the eventual conquest of Jerusalem. Whatever his intention, the momentum exceeded his control. The rallying cry associated with that day, Deus Vult, or God wills it, spread rapidly across towns and villages, becoming the unifying slogan of a movement that would soon advance across continents. Before the knights and nobles had even begun to raise their banners, another movement swept across Europe in the spring of 1096. This was not the carefully arranged expedition promoted by lords and bishops, but an outpouring of fervor from peasants, minor knights, and self-proclaimed holy men. Later called the People's Crusade, it was less an army than a wandering mass of devotees. They carried with them the same promise of salvation preached at Clermont, but lacked the wealth, skill, or leadership necessary to sustain such an undertaking. At its center stood figures like Peter the Hermit, a preacher whose visions of divine direction convinced thousands that the long journey to Jerusalem could be managed with nothing more than faith. These bands traveled with families, livestock, and carts packed with whatever possessions they could manage to drag along. Unlike the nobles who would later secure financing and supplies, they relied on scavenging and charity. Conviction replaced planning, and disorder struck almost immediately. Many held the naive belief that the Holy City lay just beyond the next ridge, without understanding the enormous distance that separated them from their goal. For some, hunger, fatigue, and the strain of the road killed them before they even left European lands. The idea that the heavenly reward outweighed any earthly suffering turned their march into something closer to a moving shrine than a military expedition. But the journey did not remain peaceful. Along the Rhine Valley, several groups turned violently against Jewish communities in towns like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. Ostensibly on their way to liberate distant Jerusalem, they committed massacres against neighbors, looted property, and forced conversions. These episodes formed a grim prelude to the campaign, often forgotten compared to battles in the East. They reflect how unstable and unpredictable this wave of religious zeal could be when unbound from central authority. By the time the Crusaders reached Byzantine territory, the Emperor Alexios I quickly realized the danger their presence posed. He had asked for seasoned warriors, not mobs of undisciplined zealots harassing his subjects. Seeking to remove them from Constantinople before they caused greater harm, he arranged for their ferries across the Bosporus into Asia Minor. There, left largely to their own direction, they became easy prey for the Seljuk Turks. Near Nicaea in the late summer of 1096, their lack of armor, supplies, and tactics led to a devastating ambush. Within days, their scattered divisions were cut down. Leaders like Walter Sans-Sauveur fell in combat, while Peter the Hermit withdrew to Constantinople before the confrontation. Survivors were few, and what had begun with enormous crowds ended in ruin. Militarily, the People's Crusade accomplished nothing. Yet, it revealed how broad and reckless the appetite for holy war had become. Even farmers on oxen, villagers wielding farm tools, and one strange band following a goose they regarded as divinely inspired believed themselves part of a sacred mission. In the final weeks of 1096, a far more organized wave of crusaders began to gather across Europe. Historians call this the Prince's Crusade. Unlike the undisciplined masses of the earlier People's Crusade, these were armies led by experienced nobles, men with resources, ambitions, and reputations forged in war. They came not under a single banner, but as rival contingents united by a common promise: eternal reward through service to the cause. Each contingent came from a different corner of Latin Christendom. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lotharingia, gathered forces from modern Belgium and the Rhineland. From southern France marched Raymond IV of Toulouse, already one of the wealthiest lords in the region. The Norman world contributed its own commanders, with Bohemond of Taranto raising men from southern Italy, and his nephew, Tancred, accompanying him with a reputation for audacity. Robert, son of William the Conqueror of England, left Normandy to take part, while Hugh of Vermandois, brother of King Philip I of France, brought his following as well. Each leader carried hopes shaped by politics at home and the lure of prestige abroad. Some expected nothing more than glory and forgiveness, while others also pondered the chance to seize lands in the East. Their companies looked nothing like the ragged pilgrims of the earlier attempt. The princes brought mounted knights, archers, infantry, and even engineers skilled in siege equipment. Priests accompanied them to hear confessions and conduct liturgies, while merchants and camp followers swelled the numbers. Many nobles also hired writers to record their progress, not only to preserve the events, but to immortalize their own names. The expedition had become as much about reputation as piety. Every army converged on Constantinople, where Emperor Alexios I Komnenos faced a difficult challenge. He needed the Crusaders' strength to regain lost territory, but he also feared their ambitions. To protect Byzantine interests, he demanded oaths of loyalty, insisting that reconquered lands be returned to imperial control. Some leaders swore, understanding the political necessity. Others saw little reason to honor such commitments once victory granted them possession. Among them was Bohemond, whose intelligence and striking presence made him one of the most formidable figures of the entire campaign. Chroniclers described him in terms usually reserved for mythical warriors, a reflection of the impression he left on his contemporaries. By the spring of 1097, the many contingents had crossed into Asia Minor under Byzantine escort. Ahead lay the strongholds of the Seljuk Turks, and for the first time, Crusaders faced the test of organized battle on foreign soil. What began as scattered vows across Europe had gathered into a multi-pronged army, ready to attempt what seemed unthinkable. After their success at Nicaea, the Crusader armies moved deeper into Asia Minor, turning toward one of the most formidable strongholds in the region, Antioch. The city was not only vast, but also strategically positioned, guarding the routes between Anatolia and Syria. Its massive circuit of walls, stretching for miles with hundreds of towers, made it one of the most difficult targets of the entire campaign. Yet, seizing it was crucial. Without Antioch, the road to Jerusalem was blocked. The Crusaders settled around the city in October of 1097, beginning what would become an ordeal lasting close to 8 months. The defenders were commanded by Yaghi-Siyan, the Seljuk-appointed governor. He had prepared for the assault, fortifying the gates and stockpiling supplies. The attackers, however, quickly found themselves trapped by their own decision. Antioch could not be stormed by force, and a blockade stretched resources to the limit. By winter, the Crusaders were facing shortages so extreme that knights sold armor or weapons to buy food. Horses, once the pride of mounted warriors, were slaughtered for meat. Some chroniclers later recorded unthinkable measures such as boiling down leather to survive the cold months. Desertions multiplied, with groups slipping back toward friendly territory, hoping to find better conditions than the starvation at the walls. Despite these hardships, cracks began forming inside the city itself. Early in 1098, Bohemond of Taranto made secret communications with an Armenian covert named Firuz, who controlled one of the towers. Mutual promises were exchanged, and on the night of June 3rd, the gate was opened to Crusader troops. In brutal fighting through the streets, Antioch fell to the Crusaders, who flooded into the city after months of deprivation. But the victory proved short-lived, because almost immediately, a massive force under Kerboga of Mosul arrived. Suddenly, the Crusaders were trapped within the very walls they had just captured. The besiegers transformed into the besieged. Conditions worsened quickly. Kerboga commanded a coalition drawn from across Mesopotamia, and his force outnumbered the defenders. Inside the city, morale sagged, and doubts about survival ran deep. It was in this atmosphere that a low-born visionary named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have discovered the location of the Holy Lance, the very spear said to have pierced Christ at the crucifixion. Digging beneath a church floor, he produced an iron point that many took as confirmation of divine favor. Whether forged or authentic, the timing renewed determination among exhausted soldiers. On June 28th, with Kerboga's army still outside, the Crusaders marched out of the city. Their numbers were pitiful compared to their enemies, yet Kerboga's coalition fractured, rival lords refusing to cooperate under his command. The Crusaders exploited this disunity, striking decisively and routing an army that should have crushed them. The victory became legendary, celebrated as proof that divine power guided their cause. Yet even in triumph, darker details lingered. Reports circulated of men reduced to cannibalism during the leanest days, stories that chroniclers awkwardly explained away. And Peter Bartholomew, whose vision had saved morale, later faced a trial by fire to prove his vision. He failed, dying from burns and leaving the so-called miracle shrouded in doubt. After the grueling trials at Antioch, the Crusaders paused for months before resuming their march south. By early 1099, they moved again, advancing through burnt fields and guarded crossings, often short of food and water. The heat and the hostility of the lands they crossed added to the strain, but after 3 years on the road, they had fixed their eyes on Jerusalem. Each mile closer tightened the resolve of an already battered army that numbered only about 12 to 15,000, a fraction of what had once set out. Disease thinned their ranks, divisions among leaders simmered, and supplies were limited. Jerusalem, already revered as the holiest of destinations, now stood not just as a goal, but as the final test. On June 7th, they finally reached Jerusalem. The city had changed hands during the course of their journey and was now in the hands of the Fatimid Caliphate, who had recently recaptured it from the Seljuks. Its garrison was modest, likely no more than 2,000 men, but the walls themselves posed the true obstacle. Jerusalem had long been fortified with stone defenses, towers, and gates designed to discourage any siege. The Crusaders themselves faced another immediate problem. They had almost no proper siege engines. What little they had came through an ingenious but desperate measure. Italian ships had brought supplies up the coast, and Crusaders broke down timber from vessels, dragging it overland to build towers and ladders. The process took time, during which many soldiers fell ill under the summer sun. Despite this, preparation continued. To support morale, the commanders called for ritual displays of faith, processions held barefoot around the walls, fasting, and prayers that evoked biblical precedents, especially the siege of Jericho. It was hoped that divine aid would succeed where force alone might fail. The siege began in earnest in early July. Assaults with ladders faltered at first, as defenders hurled down projectiles and fire. Yet persistence and the newly built towers shifted the balance. On July 15th, a tower placed against the northern wall enabled the Crusaders to breach the defenses. Once inside, discipline collapsed into fury. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were cut down in large numbers, the scale of the bloodshed becoming infamous in later accounts. Some chroniclers wrote images of streets flooded ankle-deep with blood. Whether exaggerated or not, the message they conveyed was clear. The capture of the Holy City came at staggering human cost. With the defenders killed or expelled, control of Jerusalem passed to the Crusaders. Sacred landmarks were seized. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were stripped and converted for Christian use, while the Church of the Holy Sepulchre became the new heart of Latin worship. Leadership fell to Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted the title of Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, although he exercised full authority over the new kingdom. The conquest shocked the Islamic world and inspired celebration across Europe, hailed not just as a victory of arms, but as a powerful sign of divine approval. When the armies of the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, they did not simply return home. Instead, they began constructing new political entities in the eastern Mediterranean. 4 principal dominions emerged, each rooted in familiar feudal structures from Europe, but transplanted into an entirely foreign landscape. These were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which became the centerpiece, the County of Tripoli, established along the Levantine coast, the Principality of Antioch in northern Syria, and the County of Edessa, actually founded earlier in 1098 during the march to Jerusalem. Collectively, these states were called Outremer, literally meaning lands beyond the sea, a phrase reflecting both their physical distance from Europe and their dependence on constant links across that sea. Despite their European foundations, these kingdoms needed to adapt. They ruled over territories where Latins formed only a minority. Populations of Eastern Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syriac Christians, Armenians, Muslims, and Jews made up the majority. Rather than displacing everyone, the new rulers often taxed rather than expelled local communities. Over time, practical coexistence developed in certain towns, with markets where Muslim and Christian merchants traded side by side. At the center of government stood Frankish rulers who imported their customs, ceremonies, and especially their law. The Assizes of Jerusalem became the name for their legal code. It offered a unique combination of Frankish feudal principles and local adaptations, ensuring that governance could address diverse realities. Different courts existed for different communities, with Latin nobles judged separately from Eastern Christians and Muslims. The law was not simply imposed, but adjusted to conditions where lords had to rule over large numbers of subjects who did not share their faith or traditions. This fusion of European and Levantine custom shows how Crusader power depended as much on adaptation as on conquest. Survival required diplomacy as much as fortifications. Continuous warfare was impossible for such small states surrounded by larger powers, and so their leaders frequently negotiated truces with Muslim rulers. They also built alliances with regional Christian groups, such as the Armenians, negotiated cautiously with Byzantium, and over the next century, even sought aid from distant Mongol forces. Trade agreements mattered just as much, keeping supplies flowing into fragile coastal strongholds. Without such arrangements, the Latin states could not have lasted. Ties with the Byzantine Empire remained uneasy. Crusaders had sworn oaths to restore former Byzantine possessions, yet in practice they often refused to hand back cities, especially where they hoped to secure their own rule. Antioch became a point of particular contention, establishing a long pattern of mistrust that poisoned relations between Greeks and Latins for generations. Economically, Outremer leaned heavily on its strongest ports. Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre became lifelines. Pilgrims, settlers, and reinforcements all traveled through them, while merchant vessels carried crucial grain and weapons. To defend their holdings, the Crusaders built massive fortresses like Croc des Chevaliers and Belvoir Castle. These stone strongholds proved so advanced that later powers adapted them for centuries, lasting well into the age of gunpowder. Even their coinage reflected local reality. Rulers of Jerusalem minted gold coins stamped with Arabic inscriptions, a reminder that commerce in the region still depended on the language and traditions of earlier Islamic states. In the decades after Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, new institutions rose to protect and sustain the fragile Latin presence in the East. These were not traditional armies, nor were they ordinary monasteries. Instead, they combined both. They were called military orders, groups of men who took monastic vows while bearing arms in defense of Christendom. Out of this unusual fusion came some of the most influential and enduring organizations of the crusading world. The first and most famous were the Knights Templar, founded around 1119 by a small band of knights led by Hugh de Payne. Their original mission was simple: safeguard pilgrims traveling to and from Jerusalem. They established their headquarters on the Temple Mount, and from this location they took their name. Members lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, just like monks. Yet, unlike the cloistered religious, their days were filled with armed patrols and training for battle. Over time, their reputation as disciplined warriors grew, and so did their wealth. Nobles across Europe donated land and money, and the Templars built an international network that stretched from England and France to Syria and Palestine. They became bankers as well as fighters, holding deposits for kings, providing loans, and even transferring funds across borders with written orders recognizable in far-off lands. Alongside them stood the Knights Hospitaller. This order had begun with a charitable mission. In Jerusalem, they founded hospitals to care for sick or injured pilgrims. Their reputation for providing meals, beds, and even medical attention soon made them indispensable. Over the decades, their mission expanded. They recruited knights to defend travelers and protect the hospitals themselves. By the 12th century, the Hospitallers had become as military as the Templars, constructing great fortresses like Croc des Chevaliers and manning garrisons across the Crusader states. They kept their role in healthcare, treating the wounded on battlefields and providing some of the best organized medical services the medieval world had ever seen. A third order, the Teutonic Knights, emerged later during the Third Crusade. German pilgrims in Acre established them first as a hospital brotherhood, following the example of the Hospitallers. Soon, they too transformed into a fighting order. While they played a role in the Holy Land, their efforts shifted northwards. In the 13th century, they launched campaigns in Prussia and the Baltic, seeking to convert or conquer pagan populations. In these regions, they left a lasting mark, building castles and ruling territories well beyond the lifespan of the Crusader states. All three orders answered directly to the Pope rather than to secular kings or local lords. This independence gave them unusual power. Their wealth, lands, and armies allowed them to rival monarchs, and their loyalty to Rome ensured ongoing papal influence in far-flung regions. Despite ideals of poverty and chastity, they became entangled in politics, property disputes, and competition for influence. The secrecy of the Templars, complete with their own codes and rites, later fed centuries of speculation and myth. Meanwhile, the Hospitallers remained known both as warriors and as caretakers, healing Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. The shock that set the Second Crusade in motion came in 1144, when the county of Edessa, one of the first Crusader states, fell to the forces of Zengi, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. This loss sent a wave of alarm through Christendom because Edessa had been considered an important buffer zone, protecting the more secure territories of Antioch and Jerusalem. The fall was not a distant matter for European rulers. It threatened to unravel the fragile foothold established in the East after the First Crusade, and showed that the Crusader states were far from permanent. For many, the catastrophe at Edessa made it clear that Christian control of the Holy Land would not survive without renewed military intervention from Europe. Pope Eugenius III responded quickly, issuing a formal call for a new crusade. His appeal might not have produced the enthusiasm needed if not for the work of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most celebrated churchmen of the age. Bernard's prestige as a Cistercian abbot and a spiritual leader gave the crusade legitimacy, and his impassioned sermons carried enormous influence across Europe. He promised spiritual rewards greater than those of the First Crusade, urging nobles, knights, and commoners alike that God demanded renewed effort. Under his persuasion, the idea of crusading again spread like wildfire, and this time the campaign attracted the attention of kings themselves. Unlike the armies that had marched before, which were led by nobles with limited resources, the Second Crusade featured two crowned rulers at the front, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Their involvement raised expectations to a new level. It was believed that with actual monarchs leading the effort, logistical organization, manpower, and commitment would far outshine the earlier crusade. The hope in the West was that this show of strength would not only recapture Edessa, but also expand Christian dominance more securely across the Levant. What followed, however, was far from the grand vision imagined at its launch. The armies of both kings suffered heavy losses even before arriving in the Holy Land. Marching across Anatolia, they faced poor planning, shortage of supplies, and relentless attacks by Turkish forces. Miscommunication between contingents only worsened the situation. By the time the Crusaders finally united in Jerusalem, their forces were exhausted and their numbers depleted. In 1148, the leaders made a controversial decision to strike Damascus. The city had not been hostile. In fact, it had often cooperated with the Crusader states against common rivals. Yet political ambition led them to target it anyway. The siege lasted only 4 days before being abandoned in chaos. The defeat marked a humiliating end, with no territory gained and little glory won. Though the Levant campaign collapsed, crusading did not stop entirely. In the same era, Northern Europeans waged war against pagan groups in the Baltic, and forces in Portugal achieved rare victory by seizing Lisbon from Muslim rule. Meanwhile, the disaster at Damascus persuaded Muslim leaders that compromise with the Crusader states was futile, a shift in outlook that later opened the way for figures like Saladin to unify resistance. Amid all this, the Crusade produced another lasting story back in Europe: the participation of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose presence and controversies on campaign played a hand in the eventual downfall of her marriage to Louis VII. The fall of Edessa in 1144 was a turning point. For the Crusaders, it came as a devastating loss, but in the Islamic world, it signaled a new opportunity. Before Zengi, Muslim responses to the Crusaders were often divided. Political fragmentation, already described in earlier chapters, had left the region vulnerable to outside intervention. What changed was the emergence of Zengi, a powerful Atabeg who ruled both Mosul and Aleppo. He was no stranger to warfare, but unlike many of his contemporaries, he began to frame the struggle with the Crusaders as more than just political rivalry or defense of territory. By presenting it in terms of jihad, Zengi cast it as a religious duty, capable of uniting disparate groups under a common banner. His victory at Edessa made him widely celebrated, not simply as a conqueror, but as a defender of Islam itself. Still, Zengi's leadership had limits. He relied on intimidation and ruthless displays of power to maintain loyalty among his subjects and allies. Support for him was often motivated by fear of his reprisals rather than deep personal devotion. This approach prevented him from forming broader coalitions, and his sudden assassination in 1146 left no clear system in place to preserve the gains he had achieved. His death might have unraveled his accomplishments, but circumstances soon placed his son, Nūr al-Dīn, in a position to inherit his authority and transform it into something much more lasting. Nūr al-Dīn proved different from his father in both style and vision. Inheriting Aleppo, he carefully expanded his reach, gradually bringing Damascus under his control and uniting much of Syria under a single, more stable rule. He combined political and military skill with a reputation for personal piety, which distinguished him from the reputation of fear attached to Zengi. His governance supported religious and educational institutions, including the founding of madrasas that reinforced Sunni orthodoxy. He built hospitals and placed emphasis on welfare, efforts that earned him adoration and helped solidify loyalty among religious scholars and common people alike. Militarily, he worked systematically to weaken the Crusader presence. He avoided reckless campaigns, preferring to pressure the territories with raids, fortress building, and psychological tactics that constantly reminded the Franks of their vulnerability. By presenting himself as the true champion of Islam, he undermined the authority and legitimacy of the Crusaders, leaving them increasingly isolated and defensive. At the same time, his court became a training ground for leaders who would later transform the struggle further. Among them was Saladin, whom Nūr al-Dīn supported during his early command in Egypt. The legacy of Nūr al-Dīn went beyond military campaigns. He established Damascus as a center of learning and healthcare, and one of his most striking achievements was the foundation of a public hospital that included dedicated treatment for mental health, a concept far ahead of its time compared to contemporary Europe. As a symbol of his wider mission, he even commissioned a wooden pulpit intended for the Mosque of Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, a place he never lived to see reclaimed. Decades after his death, Saladin honored that vision by placing the pulpit in its intended home. Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, remembered in European chronicles as Saladin, began his career not as a ruler but as a soldier in the service of Nūr al-Dīn. His rise was tied closely to the politics of Egypt during the mid-12th century, at a time when the Fatimid Caliphate still held power there. The Fatimids represented a Shia regime that often stood in opposition to Sunni authorities like Nūr al-Dīn, which made Egypt a tempting target for both Crusaders and their Muslim rivals. In 1164, Saladin arrived in Egypt as part of Nūr al-Dīn's intervention, intended to counter both internal disputes in Cairo and the advancing influence of Latin forces. Though initially overshadowed by his uncle Shirkuh, Saladin quickly stood out as a capable commander, managing both military maneuvering and political negotiation. When Shirkuh died unexpectedly in 1169, the young commander found himself positioned to inherit responsibility. With the approval of Nur al-Dīn, he was appointed Vizier of Egypt, serving for a short while under the Fatimid structure. Far from being a passive administrator, Saladin immediately set about building his authority. In 1171, only 2 years later, he formally abolished the Fatimid Caliphate. By replacing Shia leadership with Sunni institutions, he not only tied Egypt ideologically to Nur al-Dīn's vision, but also secured independent control for himself and his family. With Cairo as his base, Saladin now commanded access to Egypt's agricultural wealth, which gave him a steady resource stream for later campaigns. After Nur al-Dīn's sudden death in 1164, Saladin seized the opportunity to expand. Moving from Egypt to Syria, he undertook a careful combination of diplomacy and warfare. In some cities, he secured allegiance through negotiation, while in others, he resorted to siege and pressure. By presenting his actions as part of a wider religious mission, he strengthened his claim to legitimate leadership in the eyes of the Muslim population. Over the following decade, he gradually united Egypt and Syria into a single political sphere, a feat not achieved since before the Crusades disrupted the balance of the region. What distinguished Saladin's rule was the way he paired political skill with deeply crafted religious messaging. He sponsored Friday sermons or khutbahs in his own name to declare his commitment to jihad. This was not simply military rhetoric. It became a means to bind different areas of his realm under one shared cause. The strategy also helped him delegitimize both rivals and Crusader rulers, framing himself as the primary defender of Islam's sacred spaces. At the same time, he did not hesitate to eliminate potential threats within his circle, resorting to executions or exile when necessary to secure his position. Although later celebrated in the West as a model of chivalry, Saladin's path to power was hard-edged and carefully calculated. His consolidation of Egypt and Syria gave him unmatched economic resources, manpower, and religious authority. On that foundation, he positioned himself to launch campaigns that would transform the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. On July 4th, 1187, the Crusader experiment in the Holy Land faced its greatest disaster at the Battle of Ḥaṭṭīn. The confrontation occurred near the Sea of Galilee, where the forces of Saladin destroyed the main Frankish army in a single decisive encounter. The events unfolded after King Guy of Lusignan led his men away from a defensible position in an attempt to rescue the fortress city of Tiberias, which was under siege. The move was poorly timed. The countryside had been scorched by Saladin's forces, leaving little water or shelter. Under the blazing summer sun, the Crusader host marched across barren ground, and exhaustion set in before they reached their goal. Saladin used patient tactics to make the march even harder. His troops lit brush fires to smoke and suffocate the advancing enemy, while mounted archers struck quickly and withdrew. By the time the Crusader army neared the volcanic hills known as the Horns of Ḥaṭṭīn, thirst and fatigue had eroded cohesion. Here, Muslim forces closed in on every side. Surrounded and unable to reach the waters of Lake Tiberias, the army collapsed under waves of attacks. The true cross, a relic carried into battle as a powerful symbol of God's favor, was captured. This loss carried both practical and psychological weight, as soldiers had marched believing divine protection accompanied them. The defeat left most of the Crusader nobility in Saladin's hands. King Guy himself was taken prisoner, along with many lords who had governed the Latin states. While ransom negotiations secured the release of several of them, Saladin singled out the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller among the captives. These military orders had long been considered fierce opponents, bound by religious vows to fight to the death. Saladin judged them too dangerous to release or exchange, and he personally ordered their execution. In the aftermath, resistance across the Latin states crumbled. With the Crusader field armies eliminated, fortresses and towns fell in quick succession. Within months, Saladin moved against the ultimate prize, Jerusalem itself. In October of 1187, the city surrendered after a short siege. Instead of repeating the carnage witnessed nearly a century earlier when Crusaders had first seized Jerusalem, Saladin offered more measured terms. Civilians were allowed to ransom their freedom, while clergy remained to care for sacred spaces. Greek Orthodox churches stayed open, and although costly, the arrangement prevented large-scale massacre. Saladin understood the propaganda value of behaving differently from the conquerors of 1099. The fall of Jerusalem reverberated through Europe. Chroniclers describe public mourning, with church bells silenced and processions organized to lament the loss of the holy city. The failure sparked renewed calls for intervention, laying the groundwork for the Third Crusade. What lingered most powerfully was the symbolic loss of the true cross, never recovered and left to vanish from history, marking one of the greatest emblematic defeats of medieval Christendom. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 created an uproar across Europe that quickly turned into one of the largest military responses the Latin West had yet attempted. The Third Crusade gathered not only knights and minor lords, but was led by the most powerful monarchs of the era, Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. The hope was that their combined strength would restore Christian control of Jerusalem and undo Saladin's stunning victories. Each leader raised impressive forces, with Barbarossa's German army by far the largest. Their scale made many believe success was inevitable, yet the campaign soon faced setbacks that no amount of manpower could prevent. Barbarossa departed first, leading tens of thousands overland across Anatolia. His march demonstrated the logistical challenges of sustaining such a massive force far from home. In 1190, before he even reached the Holy Land, Barbarossa drowned while crossing a river in Cilicia. News of his death spread panic through the ranks, and much of the army melted away. Only a small remnant struggled on to join the French and English kings by sea. This sudden collapse shifted the burden of the crusade onto Richard and Philip, whose uneasy partnership shaped the rest of the campaign. When they arrived, their first major goal was the port city of Acre, already under siege by beleaguered Crusader forces. The effort dragged on for months, with grim fighting and disease eating away at both sides. By the summer of 1191, Acre finally surrendered. Though a significant victory, the siege widened distrust between Philip and Richard. Disputes over spoils and influence soon convinced Philip to return to France, leaving Richard to command almost alone. His leadership, though controversial, was marked by undeniable military talent. Richard's reputation was secured at the Battle of Arsuf later that year. Facing Saladin's mobile forces, he used rigid discipline to control his knights, refusing them to break formation despite constant harassment. At the decisive moment, he unleashed a charge that shattered enemy lines and forced retreat. This victory lifted Crusader spirits but did not bring them any closer to the walls of Jerusalem. Time after time, Richard advanced within sight of the city, only to halt. Concerns about stretched supply lines, the risk of encirclement, and the lack of strong reinforcements led him to prioritize coastal strongholds instead. Jaffa and other ports were secured, securing Crusader survival, but Jerusalem remained beyond reach. By 1192, both sides faced exhaustion. Prolonged warfare damaged resources and morale, and neither could achieve decisive victory. This led to the Treaty of Jaffa. Its terms granted the Franks a narrow coastal strip, while Christian pilgrims could safely access Jerusalem under Muslim control. The outcome satisfied few and left the central issue unresolved. Richard never reached the city he had set out to recover. On his return journey, he was captured in Europe and ransomed at staggering cost. Saladin, meanwhile, died in 1193, said to have given most of his wealth away, leaving little at his death despite ruling one of the largest realms of the Muslim world. Women rarely appear in medieval battle narratives, but within the story of the Crusades, their presence is undeniable. They came in different ranks and held different responsibilities, though most were not seen in frontline military roles. Nobles, queens, and regents often shaped policy and power struggles, while ordinary women supported the day-to-day functioning of armies in the field. Their contributions showed that the crusading experience was not limited to men-at-arms, but extended across households, families, and communities that traveled east together. Among the most famous was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who joined her husband Louis VII during the Second Crusade. Though sometimes remembered more for the controversies that surrounded her than for her practical role, her involvement demonstrated how noblewomen could command attention and influence decisions. Another figure of importance was Melisande of Jerusalem. She ruled as regent for her young son Baldwin III and exercised her authority with confidence, a rarity for women in medieval Europe. She directed funds to religious foundations, oversaw court proceedings, and effectively governed the kingdom during a time of internal strain. Her rule highlighted that leadership in the Crusader states was not always tied to male authority. Women also left impressions on chronicles for their presence in combat. Accounts speak of women wielding weapons from walls, firing arrows, or riding into danger alongside men. These examples were not common, but the fact that they were recorded at all shows how desperate certain sieges became and how blurred the lines between civilian and soldier could be. Even so, most women attached to crusading forces were not warriors, but provided labor that armies heavily depended on. Wives followed their husbands, caring for children and property while on campaign. Servants, cooks, and laundresses maintained the practical life of camps. Midwives were present as well, since crusading lasted years and families often lived within the mobile communities of an army. Diplomacy was another field where women left their mark, though less visibly. Marriages arranged between noble families of different regions, or even across faiths, created networks that could ease negotiation or secure truces. In port cities such as Tyre or Acre, where cultural boundaries were crossed daily, women's connections gave them influence that extended beyond formal politics. religious women added yet another dimension. Nuns, mystics, and pilgrims provided spiritual encouragement, sometimes through visions or prophecies that shaped the morale of fighters. Their writings and reputations remind us that the emotional and devotional life of the Crusades was not controlled by male clerics alone. At the Siege of Lisbon in 1147 during the Second Crusade, local women on both sides took an active role in the fighting. From rooftops and defensive walls, they hurled stones, fire, and boiling water into enemy ranks, turning households into mini fortresses. Centuries later, chroniclers still remembered their actions. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, with her entourage of elaborately dressed noblewomen, was accused of turning the campaign into a court on the move. Whether fair or not, these stories reveal how visible women could become in a theater supposedly dominated by men. The Fourth Crusade began in 1198 with a very different plan from how it ended. Pope Innocent III wanted the Crusaders to retake Jerusalem by striking first at Egypt, a wealthy and strategic center of Muslim power. The idea was that by capturing Egypt, the Crusaders would gain a base from which they could more easily project force into the Levant. However, bringing such a strategy to life required transportation across the Mediterranean. To meet that need, arrangements were made with Venice, whose powerful navy would carry a massive army east. What unfolded next shifted the entire direction of the crusade away from its original purpose. The Crusaders promised payment to Venice for the fleet, but when the time came, they failed to raise the agreed sum. Venice, under the leadership of the elderly but shrewd Doge Enrico Dandolo, did not simply abandon the cause. Instead, he offered the frustrated Crusaders a deal. They could settle a large part of their debt if they helped Venice capture the Adriatic port city of Zara. The problem was that Zara was itself a Christian city and a papal vassal. Innocent III had forbidden such an action, insisting that holy war must not turn against fellow Christians, but the armies, desperate to continue, followed Dandolo's proposal. Zara fell after a siege in 1202, marking the first major diversion from the Crusade's stated aim. While they lingered there, events took another unexpected turn. Envoys sent by Alexios IV, the exiled son of a dethroned Byzantine emperor, arrived to request help in restoring him to power in Constantinople. In exchange for military support, Alexios promised vast sums of money, supplies, and even the church's reunification under papal authority. For leaders short on funds, the bargain seemed irresistible. The momentum of the campaign shifted again, away from reclaiming Jerusalem to settling dynastic disputes within the Byzantine Empire. In 1203, the Crusaders entered Constantinople, installing Alexios IV as co-emperor. Yet promises of payment could not be fully kept, and soon resentment grew among the city's population. Alexios was overthrown and killed. With no money, limited supplies, and rising hostility from Constantinople's citizens, the Crusaders found themselves stranded. In April 1204, they resorted to force. Over 3 days, the city was stormed and subjected to widespread looting and destruction. Reports describe churches stripped of relics, icons smashed or taken, and even violations against monastic communities. On the ruins of Byzantine power, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared. Crusader and Venetian nobles carved up former Byzantine lands to suit their own ambitions. The sack left deep wounds that would never truly heal. The schism between Catholic and Orthodox churches, already severe, became permanent after 1204. Byzantium itself, weakened and fragmented, never recovered its earlier strength. Relics taken east still stand in western cities such as Venice, where the bronze horses of the Hippodrome were placed on St. Mark's Basilica. Even Innocent III, initially outraged, eventually accepted the outcome, seeing some advantage in a papal foothold over Constantinople. The year 1212 produced one of the most unusual episodes in the long history of crusading. Later chronicles describe what came to be known as the Children's Crusade, an event that captivated writers for centuries, though its details remain uncertain. The story is often told as if thousands of Christian children marched with the belief that their innocence would succeed where armies had failed. In reality, what happened was far less clear, involving a mixture of youth, peasants, and destitute adults swept up in religious enthusiasm. Two figures emerge in the accounts. In France, a shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes is said to have preached a message that God had chosen him to lead followers to recover Jerusalem. To the east, in Germany, Nicholas of Cologne played a similar role, gathering large groups of young people energized by his vision. These leaders inspired processions that stretched for miles, gaining attention as people marched across the countryside. The gatherings were not organized in secret. Rather, they were public movements, displaying a level of piety that drew the support of parents, clergy, and bystanders. Unlike earlier crusades, these were not sanctioned by the church. No papal bull authorized them. They developed spontaneously, reflecting the intense religious climate of the early 13th century. Prophecy, visions, and the notion that the sins of knights had doomed military crusades played into the belief that only the purity of children could renew divine favor. The movements relied on powerful symbolism rather than weapons. Participants expected miracles, such as seas parting to allow them passage, echoing biblical stories of salvation. The French contingent reportedly made its way south to Marseille. Chroniclers claim that once they arrived, many expected the Mediterranean itself to open before them, granting a direct path to the Holy Land. No miracle came. Instead, they faced difficult choices. Some returned to their homes, while others boarded ships offered by merchants who promised safe passage. According to later accounts, of 7 vessels that carried them, 2 sank in storms, drowning all passengers, while the rest reached North Africa. There, many were reportedly sold into slavery, a betrayal that contrasted starkly with the hopeful beginnings of their pilgrimage. Nicholas's German following crossed the Alps into Italy, enduring hunger and exhaustion along the way. Their hardships soon scattered them, and while Nicholas himself disappears from the record, some stories suggest he attempted another journey and was later executed for his failed promises. For most participants, the conclusion was anticlimactic. They simply drifted back to their villages, their visions unrealized. This movement highlights a broader tradition of unofficial crusades. It reflected widespread desires for lay participation in religious struggles, bypassing traditional authorities. The Children's Crusade illustrated both the power and danger of mass religious enthusiasm when disconnected from practical leadership and planning. Though often romanticized in later centuries as an innocent tragedy of literal children, The reality points more to adolescents and impoverished groups who symbolize the depths of popular belief in an age defined by spiritual fervor and hope for divine intervention. The Fifth Crusade was launched with a focus on Egypt rather than directly on Jerusalem, because many leaders in Europe believed the Nile Delta was the true key to controlling the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt held immense agricultural wealth, and its rulers commanded the resources that supported resistance to the Crusader states. In 1217, armies gathered under figures like King Andrew II of Hungary and Leopold VI of Austria, with the papal legate Pelagius taking a central role in directing policy. Their target became Damietta, a city on the Nile that controlled access into Egypt's interior. Capturing it required a long siege, stretching through hardship and disease, but by 1219, the city fell. It seemed, for a moment, as though this campaign might succeed where previous efforts had failed. The victory quickly turned hollow. Al-Kamil, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, offered the Crusaders a diplomatic solution. He proposed trading Jerusalem and other holy places in exchange for their withdrawal from Egypt. Yet the leadership in the Crusader camp did not accept the plan. Instead, encouraged by their recent success, the army pressed deeper into Egyptian territory in search of a final triumph. The decision proved disastrous. When floods on the Nile rose in 1221, the advancing Crusaders found themselves trapped on inundated ground. The river cut off their supply lines, disease spread through the ranks, and morale collapsed. The army had little choice but to surrender. Damietta, the precious achievement of the campaign, was handed back. The entire effort ended in humiliation, and many saw it as proof that reckless ambition had outweighed practical judgment. Several years later, another attempt emerged, this time under the direction of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. The Sixth Crusade looked very different from the military campaigns before it. Frederick had already angered Pope Gregory IX by delaying his departure for the Holy Land, leading to his excommunication. When he finally set sail in 1228, his standing with the Church was strained, but he compensated with strategy of a different kind. He relied not on battles, but on negotiation. Meeting with Al-Kamil, the same Egyptian sultan who had faced the Fifth Crusade, Frederick struck an agreement. Al-Kamil faced rival claims within the Muslim world, and a treaty offered him breathing space. The two leaders signed the Treaty of Jaffa in 1229, returning Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to Christian control without a single major clash of arms. Muslims retained access to Jerusalem, and Islamic authorities continued to administer the Temple Mount. This arrangement was almost unique in crusading history, a peaceful transfer of the Holy City. Despite its success, Frederick's diplomacy stirred anger. Many crusaders and church officials considered his methods illegitimate, especially since he had been excommunicated when he claimed the crown of Jerusalem for himself. This settlement lasted less than a decade before Muslim forces restored dominion, yet the episode revealed a new pattern, that diplomacy, not just war, could shift control in the crusading world. Life on a crusade was not defined only by the clash of swords. For most participants, it meant endless marches under the sun, nights on rough ground, and weeks of hunger and thirst. The journey across Anatolia or the deserts of the Levant was not just exhausting, but lethal. Men carried their lives on their backs, often walking barefoot or with worn shoes that offered little protection. Long campaigns meant soldiers grew weaker before they even faced an enemy, and the strain of travel itself could be as dangerous as battle. Food was always uncertain. Troops tried to survive on whatever provisions they managed to carry: grain boiled into porridge, dried beans, bits of salted meat, or the ship's hard bread known as bisque, which often had to be soaked before it could be chewed. Once supplies thinned, desperation took over. In some campaigns, desperation drove soldiers to extremes, reducing entire units to foragers scouring the wilderness or fighting over scraps. In the direst moments, hunger led some to forage for weeds or gnaw on grass, while starvation steadily consumed morale. Even when the soldiers found food, clean water presented another crisis. Mediterranean summers left wells dry, and in arid regions, what water did exist was sometimes fouled by defenders hoping to weaken besieging armies. Men drank from stagnant pools or mixed wine with bad water to hide the taste, leading to outbreaks of dysentery. Beer and wine were safer, but limited, rarely enough for the numbers marching east. Dehydration alone killed thousands during summer marches, and thirst shaped the very rhythm of crusading warfare. Conditions in camp made matters worse. Armies settled outside a fortified town for weeks during sieges, but latrines were often shallow pits, easily contaminated and positioned close to water supplies. Soldiers and animals crowded onto the same ground, spreading vermin quickly. Lice and fleas were nearly universal, and with rot from unburied bodies nearby, disease coursed through the rows of tents. Epidemics sometimes wiped out more crusaders in a month than years of combat could. Equipment added to the hardship. Knights with proper mail coats suffered under heavy layers of iron in the Levantine sun, sometimes overheating before battle began. Poorer infantry lacked protective armor altogether, relying on padded gambesons, spears, or repurposed farming tools. Weapon quality varied widely, with many ill-armed men thrown into the same battles as the wealthy elite. This imbalance often determined who lived long enough to fight another day. Army order was inconsistent. Some leaders maintained codes of discipline and rationing, while others ignored control. Soldiers at times turned on villages meant to supply them, looted churches, or quarreled within their own ranks. Alcohol fueled brawls, yet religion structured the same communities. Daily prayers, processions, and visits to relics reminded fighters that death would come quickly. Priests heard confession before attacks, so men believed they entered battle prepared for salvation. Armies rarely moved alone. Families, merchants, artisans, and prostitutes marched alongside them. These groups provided critical support, repairing weapons, cooking, and caring for the wounded, though their presence slowed movement and complicated logistics. The staggering toll was clear. During the First Crusade's passage through Anatolia, nearly half of the participants never lived to see Jerusalem. Some grew so desperate for water that they split open dead horses to drink whatever liquid remained inside. While battles in the eastern Mediterranean often dominate our view of crusading, the idea of holy war also shaped conflicts within Europe itself. The papacy encouraged campaigns not only against distant Muslim powers, but also against neighboring groups it viewed as obstacles to Christian expansion or threats to religious unity. By redefining local wars as crusades, church leaders extended the spiritual promises once reserved for Jerusalem to campaigns much closer to home. This shift allowed rulers to claim they were defending Christendom while also pursuing land, power, and influence under papal blessing. The Iberian Peninsula became one of the most enduring fronts of crusading activity. For centuries, Christian and Muslim kingdoms coexisted, traded, and fought across the region. By the late 11th century, renewed conflict in Spain was reframed as part of the wider crusading movement. Victories like the capture of Toledo in 1085 became key symbols of Christian advancement. When Lisbon was taken in 1147 with help from passing northern crusaders, its fall was celebrated as a holy triumph equal to events in the Levant. Monarchs of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal received indulgences and papal approval, linking their wars of reconquest to the larger crusading cause. Beyond military reward, participating knights gained privileges at home, including land and reduced taxes, making the campaign in Spain both spiritually sanctioned and materially rewarding. Far to the north, another form of crusade unfolded along the shores of the Baltic. Here, Catholic lords and religious orders targeted pagan groups such as the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians. The Northern Crusades were justified as a mission to spread Christianity, but they also became a vehicle for conquest and colonization. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword, and later the Teutonic Knights, founded fortified settlements, churches, and administrative centers, tightening control over territories won through war. Resistance by the native tribes often ended with forced baptisms and mass deportations, and in some regions, entire cultures disappeared. Unlike the Crusades to the Levant, which waned after the 13th century, these campaigns stretched well into the 15th century. In fact, Lithuania did not accept Christianity officially until late in that period, making it one of the last major European regions converted under pressure of crusading force. Crusading violence was not limited to non-Christians. In southern France, papal authorities supported the Albigensian Crusade, a war against Cathars between 1209 and 1229. The Cathars taught a dualistic faith rejected by the Catholic Church as heresy. Northern French nobles were encouraged by the papacy to march south, and the campaign ended with widespread killings, burnings, and displacement of entire communities. The city of Béziers became infamous when armies slaughtered thousands of inhabitants without distinction between Cathars and Catholics. In the long term, the Crusade not only destroyed the Cathar movement, but also brought the wealthy region of Languedoc under royal French control, reshaping the political map of France. Through these campaigns, crusading became increasingly flexible, adaptable to the ambitions of kings, nobles, and the papacy alike. A concept once tied to reclaiming Jerusalem now served as justification for wars of conquest, suppression, and expansion across Europe's frontiers. Far from being a singular event, crusading turned into a political and religious instrument that endured for centuries. King Louis IX of France stands out among crusading kings not only because he led 2 expeditions, but also because the Church later canonized him as a saint. His image as a pious monarch contrasts sharply with the harsh realities of his military adventures. Both of his campaigns ended in disaster, yet they reveal how much weight the crusading ideal still carried in the 13th century, even at a time when earlier setbacks might have discouraged others. The Seventh Crusade began in 1248, with Louis directing his attention toward Egypt. Like previous crusaders, he believed that holding Egypt would allow a permanent foothold in the region and a clear path to Jerusalem. His army was large, carefully supplied, and supported by the resources of the French crown. When Louis landed at Damietta in 1249, success seemed immediate. The port city fell quickly to his forces, raising hopes that the strategy might succeed. Yet, that momentum did not last. From Damietta, Louis pushed toward Cairo, convinced that controlling the Egyptian capital would break Muslim power. The campaign faltered almost at once. Heavy flooding from the Nile slowed the army's progress across marshy terrain, while resistance from local forces grew stronger. At the town of al-Mansura, the Crusaders marched into a prepared ambush. Many nobles and knights fell in chaotic fighting through the streets, and large portions of the army were killed or trapped. Louis himself was taken prisoner in 1250, alongside his brothers and key commanders. To secure release, he agreed to a costly ransom and the evacuation of Damietta. Although his campaign had collapsed, Louis did not leave the region immediately. He remained in the Levant for several years, directing funds toward the repair and fortification of coastal cities still under Christian control. His presence stabilized these outposts and encouraged continued resistance, but he failed to gain new ground. By 1254, he returned to France, where his rule continued with reputation intact as a devout and determined leader. 16 years later, Louis raised the cross again. In 1270, he launched what became known as the Eighth Crusade. This time, his target was Tunis in North Africa. The plan was to build a base of operations close to Egypt and persuade the local ruler either to convert or ally with him. Yet within weeks of landing, the army was struck by a sudden outbreak of disease, likely dysentery or typhus. The epidemic tore through the camp, and Louis himself grew ill. He died on August 25th, reportedly lying on ashes in a sign of penitence, whispering the name of Jerusalem as his life ended. After his death, his remains were treated in a way common for kings who died far from home. His body was dismembered, boiled to separate flesh from bone, and distributed for burial. His death marked not only the failure of another expedition, but also the fading of crusading enthusiasm at its height. By the mid-13th century, Crusader power in the eastern Mediterranean had been reduced to scattered strongholds along the coast. At the same time, a new regime rose in Egypt that would soon define the final chapter of the Crusades. These were the Mamluks, a military elite originally made up of enslaved soldiers, often of Turkic or Circassian origin. Trained from youth and converted to Islam, they developed into one of the most disciplined fighting forces of the medieval world. In 1250, they seized power in Cairo and built a dynasty that lasted for centuries. Their rulers combined tight military control with religious authority, presenting themselves as defenders of Islam while pursuing a relentless strategy to remove the remaining Latin states. One of the most famous Mamluk leaders was Sultan Baybars, who ruled from 1260 to 1277. He gained prestige by defeating the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a victory that ended the threat of Mongol expansion into Syria and marked a turning point in regional history. With his position secure, Baybars directed his armies against Crusader fortresses. He employed siege engines capable of hurling massive stones, undermined the walls with mining operations, and used psychological pressure to break resistance. His campaigns steadily reduced Crusader holdings, but he also employed diplomacy where useful, making truces with some Latin leaders to isolate others. While feared as a commander, Baybars was equally known for his administrative reforms at home, including a postal relay system with signal towers and carrier pigeons that kept communications fast and reliable across his empire. By the late 13th century, the remaining Latin territories were thin coastal enclaves centered on Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli. They lacked reinforcements from Europe, where enthusiasm for Crusades had waned. The papacy's calls fell on indifferent ears. Kingdoms looked to their own conflicts, and the isolation of the Crusader states became ever more obvious. When Baybars died, his successors carried on the same agenda with determination. Sultan Qalawun captured Tripoli in 1289, erasing one of the last major Crusader principalities. 2 years later, his son, al-Sharaf Khalil, advanced on Acre, the largest Crusader city and the symbolic heart of what remained of Outremer. In 1291, after a fierce and bloody siege, Acre fell. Latin power in the Holy Land collapsed completely. The survivors retreated to Cyprus or returned to Europe, and with the loss of Acre, no serious attempt was ever made to rebuild the Crusader states. The Mamluks ensured that these victories were permanent. They destroyed fortresses, massacred garrisons, and prevented Latin settlers from retaking ground. With this, the era of Crusader Outremer came to an end. During the fall of Acre, many civilians crowded into Templar fortresses by the harbor, which resisted for days until its great tower suddenly collapsed, crushing both defenders and attackers. Despite such brutality, Baybars himself remained admired for his governance, balancing his legacy as both destroyer of Crusader kingdoms and builder of a tightly organized Islamic empire. The First Crusade was not just a holy war. It blended faith, ambition, and greed. The 1099 capture of Jerusalem marked the beginning, not the end, of a long conflict that reshaped Christian-Muslim relations and fractured ties with Byzantium. What followed were centuries of war, diplomacy, and shifting purpose. Was it salvation or a lasting catastrophe? If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover.